I'm pleased to welcome Professor Dr. Bernhard Pörksen. He's a media scientist and he lectures at Tübingen University. And his book, Digital Fever, Taming the Big Business of Disinformation, came out in April of this year. Mr. Pörksen, welcome. So, first of all, the question which is somehow the heading for today. How can journalists combine short-termism and long-term ways of thinking? We'll talk about that in a moment. But first of all, let's talk about Ukraine, because you also commented on how journalists have to struggle with disinformation. So my first question is, when did disinformation actually become big business? I think by 2016 at the latest. After the disinformation spectacle of the US elections and then the Facebook campaign in 2017, then the pro-Brexit decision. After all that, we saw just how big a role disinformation is playing today in many respects. Because misinformation, and we can see that worldwide, is destabilizing democracies and, you know, propagandists and bullshitters and people like that are becoming more powerful as a result. At the same time, and this is not quite as well known, it actually attacks the very debates that we have in a society, because we do not only look at things long-term, it's compromises, finding solutions. You know, all the big crises are of a global nature, and all global crises therefore require global cooperation, and disinformation is driving a wedge between us in this context. And disinformation is also dangerous because it is actually lethal in some respect, and we saw that during the pandemic. I'm not just talking about the QAnon idiots who were storming the Capitol with violence erupting, but also vaccination opponents, you know, who came up with all sorts of false news, fake news. So disinformation is not fun, not fiction, it is potentially lethal. And you're saying it's a global problem. So what has turned out to be a good remedy against disinformation? Well, I think open societies need to deal with that. It's a systemic challenge. We have media education, which is probably a vital prevention method. Finland is a pioneer here, following the annexation of Crimea, for instance, which triggered a major disinformation campaign on the part of Russia. Finland set up an exemplary media program, critical thinking starting from school, and they looked at different sources, identifying their reliability, starting at a very early point. And they set this up as a nationwide program. In Germany, we have a federal system, which means that we have a somehow scattered media landscape. And sometimes people believe in this country that it's enough just to distribute a couple of thousands of iPads across various schools and then the job is done. No, what we need is real media education. And current studies, which are well-founded, show that we also need to change our timing. When we are checking facts, then sometimes we're lagging behind. Someone once wrote about the fact-checking of Washington Post that somebody is trying to fix the water tap while the house is already on fire, which means we're too late. Things are already happening. Propagandists already have a major advantage, and this is something that we need to change. So we need pre-bunking rather than post-bunking, meaning dealing with the disinformation patterns in a preventative fashion. And this is something that we've learned from this disinformation war, and it is a lesson learned, because that's, you know, Ukraine, the American intelligence agencies, and, you know, we also used swarm intelligence, you know, showing satellite images to counteract such campaigns in a preventive fashion. Let me give you one example. Right at the beginning of the war, there was a deepfake video on Zelensky, where he allegedly, asked his soldiers to go home and stop fighting. And interestingly, the people in Ukraine had been warned before, which is why it didn't work. First of all, they had been warned up front. And then secondly, Zelensky did a selfie video himself. That's what I refer to as pre-bunking. And the bigger idea behind is, why don't we look at the fight against disinformation as a futuristic job? On the one hand, of course, we are very schematic, very clear in what we do, so that our opponents also know what we are going to do. And when you look at climate change and different things, then you don't need to be a major prophet to know what those who want to fight these tendencies are going to do. So what we need here is we need to come up with serious information, with education, before fake news is spreading all around. And this is something that has not really been tested enough. Okay, but pre-bunking also means that people are willing to accept facts and the truth. And what if even journalists are not coming through? I'm thinking of the US, for instance. I sometimes have a feeling that a lot of people are so locked up in their own disinformation bubble that they really don't care about real facts. Well, I can't come up with a panacea here, but one possible method might be related to communication psychology. Back to Ukraine. On the 17th of March, a Republican politician, Arnold Schwarzenegger, brought out a highly interesting video, and I'm guessing some of you may have seen it. So what did Arnold Schwarzenegger do in this video? He's a superstar in Russia, and in that video, he actually tried to encourage people to protest against Putin, to shake up the way they look at the world. And he did that like a trained psychologist. He showed a great deal of appreciation. The first 4 or 5 minutes are just one big declaration of love to the Russian people. So this is down to certain aspects of psychologically based and trained communication that may also help us to make some headway here. So what am I getting at? We should not only look at, how to face conflict and how to pick up a fight where necessary, but at the same time, we should resort to communication psychology in order to also reach those who are thinking completely differently and whom apparently we can no longer reach in any other way. And that leads to all sorts of methods, and there are communication methods that are used to help managers suffering from burnout or couples who are having major problems and who are trying to reconcile. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, he did a great job in using these very methods in his video. And now the question is, what can media workers, what can journalists do? And in your book, you are saying that at this day and age, journalists short-circuit the private and the public awareness of things. What does that mean? I wasn't only referring to journalists here, it actually refers to all of us. This is the state of the world of media that we are witnessing right now. We always have these indiscreet technologies on us all the time. We don't say that. That's what the scientists in Tübingen are saying, and I'm talking about the smartphone. The smartphone actually merges the world of leisure, of work. The world is far away and very close at the same time. And I think it has happened to all of us that we sent an email to the wrong recipient at some stage. And these new media technologies, they are very fascinating, and they make it possible that public and private awareness, information and emotions are somewhat merging. And I think this is overtaxing us. I think this is one of the biggest reasons for the irritability that we can see everywhere. Things are happening too fast, whether they are trivial or non-trivial, emotional or not emotional. That's what I meant. Well, we are no longer the only gatekeepers as journalists. So it's a threat or an opportunity for journalists. Well, I'd say that it is definitely a major challenge to justify authority in new ways, because in the past authority was just a normal thing. You were sorting things as relevant or non-relevant as a gatekeeper, but now there are a lot of different players, a lot of different voices. Some people will be working against you, others are supporting you, and some people are giving you very important information to get the job done. And all this is happening simultaneously. And I think at the moment we are in a transitional phase. Maybe it is something like the digital puberty of the networked society. And, you know, there's so much energy and there's such a great deal of irritation and anger out there. And I think we need journalists to come to grips with this, because this also provides an ethical foundation. Don't make an event bigger than it is. All these are maxims that are relevant to all of us today. So now, finally, the actual heading of this talk. How can journalists combine short-termism and long-term ways of thinking? And how do you look at this against the backdrop of the climate crisis, for instance? Well, let me make a very tough and sweeping statement here, and I'm talking about serious journalists in particular. Journalism is stuck in the wrong time sphere. It is focusing on what is current, it is focusing on hypes, it is focusing on the moment. One decisive factor of relevance is not whether something is happening right now, but whether it may be relevant in the long term as a problem. And this is where journalists could and should, and we are dreaming here at this wonderful symposium, could and should actually, you know, not just look at things from the point of view of whether it is currently important, but whether it might be relevant in the long run. So what do people really care about? And I'm not just talking about the climate crisis here, which is hard to convey to people anyway. It may also be a huge octopus in a Japanese port. Well, let's stay with the climate crisis for a moment. Do you think journalists should become some sort of activists? Where are the boundaries here? Just to be able to communicate the sense of urgency. No, activism actually means that you made a decision on how to look at reality, by all means. And I think it would be very bad for journalists if it became more activist. It would make journalism more vulnerable. But from my point of view, journalists need to learn. And when we talk about political journalism, for instance, we need to bid farewell to the old power patterns. Why is it so important to political journalists what's happening behind the scenes? And I'm asking you here. Of course, you can come up with all sorts of gossip. Who maybe had a go at someone at a late-night meeting behind closed doors. Actually, it's silly to even discuss these sort of things because we're facing existential threats. If political journalists were to become more aware of what's happening to the environment, for instance, identifying what is really relevant rather than just describing the cynical game of power, then I think we would have made some major headway. Last question, Mr. Pörksen. In an interview, you said doing things together is becoming more difficult, but also more important. So how can we make that happen? Well, you're really coming up with the toughest questions here. I'm afraid I don't have an ad hoc answer to this question. I think it's a combination of setting up a value-oriented education system that should also start at schools. We also have to involve the world of arts. We need to identify what makes for a good argument, what not. We need to have dialogue and transparency and a policy that bids farewell to old formulas and instead is moving towards to a more natural sort of dialogue that we can see in parts of the new German government right now. Are there any examples of a successful cooperation here, doing things together? Well, I'm looking at Robert Habeck here, for instance, and from a media point of view, he's a very interesting person. He's facing a great deal of dilemmas. And of course, a lot of the things that he is struggling with are painful, and he communicates this. He shares it with his audience, of course, only to a certain point. And we don't want to see a desperate politician who doesn't know what they're doing, but he can put it across. And I think that makes him credible. And that's the more human, more natural way of communicating that I was referring to. And at the same time, the federal chancellor is criticized at the moment for just talking about results. And I am, an excellence campaign on legs kind of thing. That is just the other pattern. Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting and dynamic talk, Mr. Pörksen.